Welcome. Thank you for attending today's webinar hosted by the Organization Development and Change program at Penn State. Today, we have the great pleasure of welcoming our presenter, Dr. William Brendel. My name is Layla Farzam, and I am the Alumni Ambassador for the Organization Development and Change program. We also have Jenny Lee with us today, who will be managing our chat feature. In terms of the interactive format for this webinar, please open the chat feature in the Zoom platform to interact and ask questions for the Q&A segment. If for some reason you get disconnected from our presentation, please use the same Zoom link to re-enter. Our online Master of Professional Studies in Organization Development and Change can help you to prepare and implement quality and continuous improvement initiatives in an organization. Furthermore, there's a PhD program in Workforce Education and Development with a concentration in Human Resource Development and Organization Development. Our program has created a continuous monthly webinar series from experts around the world. Today, we welcome Dr. Brendel.
William T. Brendel is an assistant professor of organization development and change at Penn State University. He earned his doctorate from Columbia University. Bill's research investigates how the ancient wisdom tradition of mindfulness practice may be applied to develop ethical leaders, innovative strategies, and inclusive cultures. Bill serves on the board of trustees for the Organization Development Network, as well as the Organization Development Education Association. Dr. Brendel is also the CEO and lead consultant at the Transformative Learning Institute. Over 10 case studies of his work, drawn from the approach you will learn today, may be found at www.transformativelearning.institute. Here's Dr. Brendel.
Thanks, Jenny, and thank you, Layla, and welcome everyone to this webinar. Let me ask you a quick question. If you could just quickly test out your chat box there and let us know who you are. Maybe your position, your organization. If you're Penn State, maybe a little hashtag me too. And let's all look at the chat box and get a sense of who's here. So if you have a couple of seconds here to type in where you're from, what you do, so we can get a sense of who the audience is. And I can tell you as we wait for people to add their information, there are people that have come from organizations like the World Bank, the UN, BBC, NBC, Microsoft, Accenture. We have a bunch of universities represented today. We have American University, George Washington, UC Berkeley, NYU, Ohio State, the University of Michigan, and many, many more that I can't possibly remember. We have also government representation here. We have the Department of Energy, the Department of Education, the Armed Services, and it's just overwhelming the diversity of representation we have here today, which may indicate the importance of this topic that we refer to as innovation, and also this topic that we refer to as organizational culture. So what you're looking at right now is a masterpiece by a Japanese artist named Hokusai, and it's titled The Great Wave. I picked this painting to kick off our discussion today because in many ways it captures how many of us experience the world lately. Not just the outer world, but our inner worlds, our minds, and often struggling to make sense of this new period of hyper disruption ultimately. And I'm going to be referring to this period of time as a period of whitewater, or the age of whitewater. Now, this webinar experience, if you can't tell already, is designed to have a bit of a call and response rhythm so that you can add and imprint your thoughts and insights as we move along. And then in this way, the presentation will be just as much yours as it is mine. We have a lot of expertise out there. Questions that I'm not able to answer during the presentation itself will be collected by our great moderators, and then somewhere along halfway through this presentation, we will pause and ask these questions, and I'll see if I can answer them, and if not, we'll see if we can figure it out together. And then we're going to conclude with a Q&A portion at the very end. Now, there's three parts to this presentation. The first part really sets the stage for our discussion by really providing a clear and powerful business case for an engaged creative culture in organizations, particularly in these unpredictable times. Part two is going to demonstrate the weakness of our current talent management and performance paradigms, and it's going to offer an alternative third dimension for really upping our game when it comes to innovation, and we really need to do that soon. And part three will integrate social and technological aspects of organizational development that have already started in a lot of organizations in some really unique and surprising ways to stimulate innovation. So what is organizational culture? Let's just start with a little overview of what organizational culture is, some level setting here, and why does an engaged culture matter so much? Well, first, let's consider how the tip of this iceberg might represent your organization in an observable sense. So this is the stuff that you see, you hear, the things that are measured, and so on and so forth. That's kind of how we go through our organizational life. We've got our eye on these specific things, but culture runs far deeper in an organization. And Ed Schein, who writes about organizational culture, provides many amazing descriptions of culture and levels, but ultimately what organizational culture is are the subconscious shared expectations beneath the surface that drive the visible behaviors that we see. And so there are many dimensions of organizational culture, but the dimension of culture that we want to talk about today is engaged versus disengaged. And as you can see here, a disengaged culture has a mighty cost to organizations these days. And these statistics that I'm about to show you are old in the sense that they're only about a half a year or so old. Some of them are 2 or 3 years old, but they were all pre-coronavirus, pre-social unrest, pre-election season. So what you're going to see here is just things as they were before stuff hit the fan, so to speak. So disengaged culture costs organizations millions, if not billions of dollars every single year. And in contrast, an engaged culture actually really assists in profitability of an organization in many, many different ways. And one of the things that I find interesting is this statistic from the Huffington Post, and that is that if you're a 150-person company with 11% annual turnover, and you want to refill a role because somebody left, $25 per person on hiring, or $25,000 per person on hiring, $10,000 on development, and you lose $50,000 on productivity. So your annual cost of turnover for this relatively small number is almost $1.6 million. That's pretty incredible. Now, when you look at an engaged culture, just a small difference can make a big difference, as you see here on the right side. Reducing it just by 20% would immediately yield value over $300,000. So not a loss, but actually a net gain. So that's kind of, just some level setting for this presentation, give you a sense of why an engaged culture is so important and what it is. But nowadays, we are really working in a very different type of paradigm. So I'm going to show you this slide right here that kind of gets to the point of our current state of conditions. You know, great leaders used to have enough time to, catch their breaths and between the waves of social and economic change, and they had time to spot fluctuations on the horizon, pivot, and forge ahead. But and the other thing is that it seemed like all possible measures to develop leaders were aimed at helping crush ambiguity, the lean in, the resilience, the grit. Those are the types of words that used to dot the bestseller lists not too long ago. And then obviously coronavirus came about. Brooding images of social unrest were shown with greater regularity. It's not that they weren't happening, but we began to actually see them and peek inside of that a little bit more. And then the bottom fell out. And you're all probably in some way or another feeling the effects of real whitewater, real change that can't be anticipated. It hits us from every direction. And so all of these, not all of them, but a lot of the institutions that we took for granted are now sort of collapsing under their own weight. And deep down, I think all of us know that struggling endlessly to keep our heads above water is really no longer sustainable. We all need insight, and we need it really fast. So as a presentation should do, it points out the need, and then what we're going to do is provide you with a bit of a solution here. But first I want to know, in the chat box, if you can, share what distracts you from work the most these days. What is it at work for you, or maybe even what your employees report, distracts you from work in this socio-historical moment in time, this very unique moment in time? Let's see what we have in the chat. Let's see what you can come up with. False news, there you go. Health, absolutely. Our own health, the health of loved ones. Extended family needs, outstanding. And here they come. Here comes the flood. Schooling from home, I'm with you there. I've got 3 kids. What a challenge. Childcare, yep, absolutely. Yep, groceries, excellent. Everything going crazy at the same time, yes. Melissa, right on. Clients looking for a silver bullet, isn't that the truth? Yeah, I feel you. I had a feeling that you'd have an answer for this question. Look at it all coming in. Oh my goodness. Great. Okay, great. Not great, but great that you have examples to share, and I appreciate that. So why don't we do this? Why don't we change it up a little bit right now at this point of the webinar? And I'm going to actually invite you right now to taste the nature of your minds, to get a sense of what's going on, the nature of your minds, because as this presentation is going to show you, it holds a lot of clues as to the way that we actually orient ourselves to all of this craziness, as that one person said. So I'm going to invite you right now to take a little trip with me into the mind, and inviting you just to briefly allow your eyes to close, or if you wish, you can establish a gentle gaze on the screen or in front of you. And in closing your eyes, I'm going to ask you to drop in on a sense of your breathing. I'm going to close my eyes too. Don't worry, I'm not falling asleep, but I'm going to be facilitating you through this very brief guided meditation. So closing your eyes and dropping in on a sense of your breathing, coming in and out of the body, moment by moment, and attending to the rise and the fall of your breath as best as you can. And if your attention gets pulled away, thinking something, wanting to do something, a to-do list, a memory, just noting where your mind has gone and honoring where it's gone without judging yourself, and bringing your attention back to your breathing in its full duration, moment by moment, and breath by breath. Just this moment, just this breath. Just this moment, just this breath. And when you're ready, allowing your eyes to open gently, and kind of coming back to this computer screen webinar, and maybe checking in on your body, how you feel right now. And if you would, I'd like you to do two things. I'd like you to type into the chat how you feel. Like, how do you actually feel right now? Checking in on your body and noting how the way you feel now is different than when you came into this webinar. So there we go. Calm, good. Grounded, peaceful, lighter, good. Now what I'd like you to do, if you can, is type down in the chat how it felt to concentrate attention on your breathing. What type of difficulties may have been present for you? The mind, external noises. My dog was scratching. Those dogs, they always get you. Quieting my mind, anxiety, my stomach growling. Well, that means you were really paying attention. Sometimes we don't catch that. Phones ringing. It was difficult. Wanting to come back to normal, that's a really interesting observation. Good. Wandering mind. These are not uncommon. Now, just think about, just put this into perspective. If you're listening to an employee, a colleague, maybe somebody that reports to you or your boss, if it's this difficult to pay attention to our breathing, which does its own thing, right? How difficult must it be to really attend to another human being when they're sharing something? That's pretty powerful when you think about it. And I want to orient us to how we pay attention at work, because it's in the way that we pay attention that you're going to find innovation and inclusion, which are both actually two sides of the same coin, as I'm going to demonstrate. How, depending on where you pay attention and how you pay attention, this becomes more or less likely. So that pull, right, that you described to normal, or to the external world, to the dog scratching, to the phone ringing, to things that you need to get done, that pull is actually, the pull itself comes from a place called access consciousness. So let's focus on the bottom of this page first. That's the mind, or the piece of consciousness that conceptualizes things. It's the piece of mind that is poised to speak about things and analyze and judge. And phenomenal consciousness, on the other hand, is this world of sensing and feeling and being present with the way things are unto themselves, without our placing a full narrative on the experience. Okay. Now, here's the thing. Access consciousness is not just hard for us because of our nature of mind. It's hard because it's been conditioned, right? We need to be able to categorize things and label things and understand them. The saber-toothed tiger, pretty important to know that that's more dangerous than another species of animal. And so through numerous years, we've been conditioned to think and spend most of our day thinking. In the organizational sphere, actually, before even we get into the organizational sphere, this has been ingrained by society. It's always important to have a clever response when you're in a discussion, right? That's something that's sort of ingrained in us. We want to fill the space. It's rewarded in organizations. Your ability to analyze, your ability to produce, to draw differences, to make predictions, all of this is rewarded. I mean, how much are you actually rewarded for sensing and being in the present moment? Probably not at all, unless you work for a really advanced organization. It's expected. Okay, so when it comes to organizational culture, access consciousness is expected. And most of all, and perhaps most importantly here, access consciousness is the way that we derive our sense of self. We spend a lot of time, padding our resumes, getting our education, creating a sense of who we are with others. I'm introduced in a very specific way to you. Is that truly me? I guess suppose it's me through this lens of access consciousness, but I and you are both far more than what we could possibly write down on a piece of paper. And what you're going to find later in this webinar is that your ego and your expertise, with both of those live in this lane, actually are counterforces to inclusion. Ego is a counterforce to inclusion, and expertise is a counterforce to innovation. Now it gets even worse because we have this big thing that's just come out called artificial intelligence. I don't know if you've heard of this, but artificial intelligence has just come out, and it is creating all kinds of problems. Now, let's just put it like this. If we were a used car in the 80s, artificial intelligence is a supersonic rocket. It is going to outpace us and outdo us in numerous ways. It is going to replace, and it is replacing, most of the operations that we perform at work. It outdoes us in terms of the breadth and depth and speed and accuracy and reliability of what we call conceptual processing, okay? And it does this through I call them four skill crushers, okay? When it comes to the skills that it's replacing for us mere mortals. The first is descriptive analysis. And descriptive analysis refers to exploring and summarizing and visualizing data, okay? Just think about how much of your workday you spend doing that. Then there's diagnostic analysis, and that refers to analyzing past data and establishing different types of links between concepts and events. Then there's prescriptive, or I should say predictive first. Predictive actually recommends what to do now and in the future, alongside prescriptive, which says this is most likely to occur. So you could see right here that AI is taking care of most of this lane of access consciousness, and it will more and more. It's stripping away work from accountants and operations folks, and numerous other things that we do at work. But it also has will crushers. So it's got a great work ethic. It does not need any encouragement. It works harder, faster, longer. It doesn't make mistakes. It has no political agenda and no bias. Just think about how many biases human beings bring because of their ego. So when you think about all of this, just you might think, okay, now that's great, but what happens if all organizations start running like this? Okay, what if they all start to look like this? Well, if they do, what you're actually going to get is something called decentralized autonomous organizations, and this is just frankly very, very scary situation. These are organizations that can do all of their processing in a transparent manner, democratically, without any hierarchy whatsoever. And it crowdsources essentially stakeholders. So it takes care of your stakeholder analysis. It takes care of your organizational efficiency, your security, your transparency. Scary, right? Because this is the stuff that organization development specialists and professional development folks concentrate on developing in organizations. So there's these things are on the rise, and that's quite scary. It should be. And this is not just sort of a movie about the future. This is actually happening right now. So while we have our minds and heads, we're trying to wrap them around coronavirus and social unrest, this is occurring in the background. And for many of us, it's going to feel like when we first saw the iPhone or smartphone, right? All of a sudden, out of nowhere, we have a computer in our hands. And the mistake that we made was we thought that email and all of this new technology was going to create more time for us, right? But what actually happened? Things sped up. Things got more intense, ultimately. Now, think about the skill-will paradigm. This is your typical skill-will paradigm. If you work in HR, or you work in any type of professional development or organization development, this is a very typical paradigm for developing organizations. It has to do with attracting, right, hiring top talent, developing it, and retaining it ultimately, because there's a war on for talent. And doing it in a way that you make sure that you really capitalize on people's expertise, their critical thinking skills, not just that, but also their ability to just not be jerks, be good people, to operate off of values and to fit a particular culture. But as we just saw, artificial intelligence is just crushing this entire zone. That's scary. So you might already be wondering, what on earth can humans do that AI can't? What type of irreplaceable value can humans bring to work? So I'm going to ask that question to you right now in the chat. Thinking about our little meditation exercise and this introduction to this technology that's about to put us all out of work, what do you think we can offer that AI can't? Let's see what you have in the chat. Let's open it up to chat. Soul and connection. Absolutely. Excellent. Genuine emotional conversations. Very nice. Critical thinking. Compassion. Very good. Good. Very nice. Feeling and empathy for coworkers. We're going to need a whole lot of empathy now, right? Humanness, duty of care for others. You don't need me to tell you what we're good for, right? Exchange of ideas. Good. All right, so right now we're kind of scratching the surface when it comes to what we're capable of. Now, what I want to do is I want to propose a different way of thinking about this. I want to take this skill-will paradigm and flip it on its head. And think, what else is it, right? Right here you're seeing a skill-will, right? Sort of, we want to be where that green dot is. That's the hope. And the 9 boxes built off of that. A lot of performance improvement approaches are built off of that. But if you think about skill and will, it's all about me, right? It's my skill. And it's also about who I am. It's me. It's my will. It's my attitude. There's no we in that. You can obviously try to make connections to we, but you do so through the lens of ego. I work well with others, right? And so what I'm suggesting here is a form of a new paradigm in this world of tumult, where what we do is we focus on something called conscious agility as the 3rd dimension. And what I mean by that is increasingly our expertise and achievements are going to matter less than our ability to be creative and compassionate, all the things that you just mentioned. Now, conscious agility in a nutshell, this is my sort of layperson's definition of conscious agility. It's our ability to basically check our expertise, or ego rather, at the door, check our expertise at the door and rise above ego. Okay, and now let's take this to its logical conclusion, or at least in a logical direction. If this is a 3rd dimension to performance and something that we need to develop, given the rise of artificial intelligence and decentralized autonomous organizations, what do we need to develop? What is it that we're developing? Well, research out there, tons of research shows that when you practice mindfulness, when you get better at dropping your ego and dropping your expertise, which kind of gets in the way of thinking creatively, if you think about it, certain things begin to get better for you. And here's what they are. All right, let me see here. You've got metacognition, okay? Metacognition isn't just what you do. It's thinking about what you're doing in real time and even thinking about thinking, which is actually a trait that's unique to human beings. Another one is self-awareness. Okay, so you all know what that is. Perspective taking becomes a little bit easier. Compassion becomes a lot more apparent. Imagination and a sense of unity with others. So these are what I'm sort of offering up to you as what's most important right now when it comes to conscious agility. But for a more formal definition, this is how I formally define conscious agility. And we're going to get into how this works in just a moment, which is the degree to which an individual can shift, right? Just like we did with meditation, shift and expand and sustain attention across both conceptual and intuitive consciousness, access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness, respectively, in order to receive insights and translate them into inclusive behaviors and innovative strategies. We cannot do this through access consciousness alone. You cannot think your way into innovation, and you cannot think your way into being more inclusive. You've got to feel your way. You have to intuit your way. And so in a weird way, AI and decentralized autonomous organizations may be forcing the best out of us. So that's something hopeful to take away, I think, from this presentation. Now, before we go any further, I want Jenny, I'm going to call Jenny in here, our moderator, to see if we have any questions so far. I believe there's a place to write your questions. Are there any questions so far from our very expressive audience?
Yes, we have two questions so far, and the first question is,
Jenny, could you speak up just a little bit? I can't hear you so well.
oh, sorry, can you hear me clearly?
Just barely. I guess be as loud as you can, and then I'll probably hear you.
Okay, one participant is asking you a question. Could you say more about the dangers of the decentralized autonomous organization? She thinks that AI takes care of the mundane work so that human can focus on being creative. So what's your opinion?
That's a great question. So a lot of research, like just published, I did some extra research before this presentation, just published, talks about how AI actually can assist with innovation. So your first point, or your second point, I should start with, is it will take on a lot of the mundane tasks it already has, right? Entire HR departments, their HRM features are actually being taken away from apps, right? But the danger here is that you can't make that your entire HR department, because human beings enter conflict. We get in trouble. We make mistakes. We make unethical decisions. Sometimes the best of us make unethical decisions and we rationalize them away. So there are an awful lot of problems inherent in this AI world. And what I'd like to ask you to do is, as all of you are listening to this presentation, maybe take notes mentally or written down, because toward the end of this innovation or presentation, I'm going to actually show you how our phenomenal consciousness, our conscious agility, can work together with AI to bring about even more amazing innovations. And there are a lot of really interesting cutting edge ways of doing this. So great question. I appreciate that. Other questions?
Yeah, second question is about removing bias. So how should organizations put their own bias aside to hire the right person for the job? So there are many younger generations that may bring more to the table, but they don't have some experiences which is required.
Right. Oh, okay. So that's an ageist bias I'm hearing. Younger folks not having the same type of experience. And, bias is tricky, right? Now, if you were to Google bias and technology and HR, one of the things that would come up is something that has all types of ethical implications on its own, which is facial recognition software. So a lot of organizations right now are moving the facial recognition software that catches little ticks and changes in the movement of your face to tell when there's a disconnect between what you're saying and what you actually believe. Okay, and this is purported to be a way to make sure that bias is eliminated in interviews. But the problem, there's a lot of problems with it, and one of the biggest problems is that there are intercultural differences in the way that we express ourselves. I happen to be very expressive. Some people don't like eye contact as much, but that does not mean that they are being untrustworthy. And so facial recognition software you need to be on the lookout for. I think it could be helpful in the future, but man, do we have a lot of kinks to work out when it comes to that. And I'm actually about to get into the world of bias right now. So if you hold on just for a minute, you're going to see how phenomenal consciousness and conscious agility allows us to see our own bias non-judgmentally, not being hard on ourselves for it, but seeing it in order to address it and let go of it in real time. Other questions, Jenny?
There are many questions, but it'll be better to deal with the question in the Q&A session later.
Okay, great. I think that's okay.
Okay.
All right. So let's move on now to this thing called conscious agility. So remember we talked about access and phenomenal consciousness, and access consciousness is that road that, AI is cutting into. They're getting right in our lane. And that's the lane of thinking, analysis, judgment, words, all of this, basically the stuff that we do every day. And phenomenal consciousness, if you remember, has to do with sensing and intuiting and feeling. It's that part of us that can feel into the sense of just this webinar. Like, just check in on your sense of well-being. Like, are you connecting? Do you feel dissonance without describing it? Now, when we talk about access consciousness, let's see here. There's you, okay? And what ends up happening is we get in this cycle of ego and expertise, because what we're doing is we're thinking, we're expected to think, we're conditioned to think, we're this idea of always having a clever response is totally ingrained in us. And this is the cycle that we get involved in. It's all in that lane of access consciousness. Here are the problems. When you're in this lane, and especially when you're in stressful situations, you have a lot of ego anxieties that crop up, and those anxieties actually become biases that make organizational functioning problematic, essentially. So just think about what you see when you're at work. I mean, ego shows up at every turn. Anxieties to stand out as a contributor. Anxieties not to make mistakes, when some of our greatest innovations come from mistakes, right? The desire to win others over. I mean, I have that desire. I want to win you over right now at this presentation. But is it about me? That's the question. So the real question with ego is it about me, right? What is the real motivation for raising a critique in a meeting, for instance, with a coworker? The inability to admit mistakes, being closed to feedback. Now, the other thing that happens is, if you think about how we, through our lifetime, essentially are conditioned to chisel our expertise, almost like sharpening a pencil, getting sharper and sharper. And when you do that, you end up seeing the world through that sharpened lens, which is access consciousness, essentially, but not through a broader lens. And when that happens, here's what you see. You see a lot of linear thinking, a lot of pride in your expertise, a lot of arguing for your side, trying to win people over that way. And the strategies develop are for stakeholders. They're not with your stakeholders. So you know better than your stakeholders what they need. That's kind of the downside of expertise. You may work with somebody who has a favorite approach to strategic planning that drives you crazy, and they think about it in one specific way. And one of the biggest things that we have a problem with is that we identify with our expertise. And you've heard the saying, don't take it personally. It's not personal. This feedback is strictly about your work. The truth is, and this is my belief, that human beings, in order to be beings and to be assessed individually, they essentially conflate their ego identity with their expertise. And so when you question someone's expertise, subconsciously what is occurring, except for people who really practice meditation and metacognition and self-awareness, is you're challenging their sense of self. You're directly challenging their ego. And there's nothing more existential than having your ego challenged. So this is low conscious agility. I want to know out there in the chat verse out there, which one of these have you seen the most? Have you seen any of these pop up the most for you, either individually or with coworkers? Go ahead and type in what you've seen happen the most. Standout contributor, absolutely. A lot of projection of blame, absolutely. Self-preservation, arguing for a side, yep. Yeah, self-preservation on its own causes all kinds of problems. Scapegoating is one of the biggest ones. Yes. Decisions for others instead of with them. Very good. Good. So none of this, none of you are strangers to any of this, essentially. Let's look at what, well, I've already asked you that question. Let's look at what high conscious agility looks like. Remember, my nutshell definition is the ability to check your expertise at the door and to rise above ego. And so what does that look like? Well, first, what it requires is getting yourself out of access consciousness. So let's take the example of interviewing somebody who's just come in for a new job. And by the way, AI can really look through resumes and weed out people who probably shouldn't be there for the job. But what is the purpose of an in-person interview anyway? It's getting a sense of who this person is deep down, right? Now, in order to do that, can you think about it? Now, if you're stuck in thinking, you're not seeing your biases necessarily, mainly ego and expertise, okay? But if you were to consciously shift to the space of how do I actually feel with this person, you might notice that you feel a sense of curiosity or interest or discomfort. And those things on their own, they're very intuitive. They don't make too much sense until you begin to unpack them. The question that then becomes, how reliable are these? And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But once you start to get outside of your thinking and ego, you begin to really see the other person as a person. And if you think about it, when you get outside of ego, you are immediately letting go of who you are and your self-preservation ways, and you're beginning to be actually more inclusive. So across a variety of settings and organizations, this includes, cohesion with teams, ethical decision-making, even if it lands poorly on you, right? Or makes your life harder, delivering bad news. I mean, do you think your way into delivering bad news? People know when you're giving them a sandwich piece of feedback, right? You start with the good piece of bread, then you get to the ugly part, then you get back to the good part again. That very rote way, those machinations of that, a lot of us experience, this inauthentic machinations, really hurt a deeper sense of inclusion. Now, at the same time, if you let go of your expertise, you open up a whole entire world for innovation. And that involves adaptive planning, right? The ability to negotiate. So not to be stuck so entirely to your side that you can't reframe the assumptions beneath your argument and maybe try to find some common ground with the other person. When is the negotiation really more about you than what you're arguing for? Design thinking, the very first step, the most important piece of design thinking is empathy, right? And in order to do that with your stakeholders, you got to let go of everything you know and just listen and just attend to them. Problem solving and self-reflection. Now, let me ask you this in the chat. Which one of these do you think your organization could stand to learn and develop the most? Let's see what you put in the chat. Which of these in these two lists could your organization in its unique context, with its unique demands and worries, which one of these? Adaptive thinking? All. Okay. Again, adaptive planning. Very good. Letting go of process and expertise. Nice. Design thinking, difficult conversations, agility. Absolutely. Cohesion across the board. So I think so far that you would generally agree. I mean, we're testing this against our own experience, that you can get trapped in thinking and yourself at work. It's very easy to do. It's kind of what we do. And that will be in large part replaced by AI and these organizations that run themselves mainly with, you know, more of a consultation from stakeholders, if anything. And we know that coming outside of ourselves and our expertise, sort of logically, even if we think about this logically, enhances our ability to be inclusive and innovative, right? So now what I'd like to do is just show you that at the individual level, right, that the sort of the individual level of conscious agility at work, that third dimension. What about organizational culture? What about collectively? So recently I went out and I did a bunch of research, looked into, you know, what organizations, what cultures, what aspects of organizational culture lead to superior performance. And if looking at all the research that fit that criteria, there were 4 things that came up. Those 4 things are: we welcome change, we're adaptive, we are a selfless organization, and we are virtuous. And look at just the list of things that come up that affect the bottom line when we measure and see these attributes of organizational culture. There's more references that I could even fit on this one screen. So if you'd like, I'll put my email at the end of this presentation, and I can also give you references and give you direction to where these pieces of the business case were made. But you're just going to have to trust me for now. There's a vast amount of literature out there. And if you look at these, ultimately what you're looking at are creativity and compassion, right? It's the ability to let go of yourself and your expertise. So let's check this against your own experience. Let's have some fun in these final minutes. A Zen master said once that the best study of the self is to forget the self. And I love that. I absolutely love that. The self really, if you think about it, is sort of a construction we've created since early childhood. We have a name, we have a, you know, a sense of who we are. We play a role in our families, and then we end up doing the same thing in organizations. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read these statements that you see in front of you. And as I read them, I want you to just think and just sort of allow, you know, the images, the things that come to mind, people to just sort of come into your mind. And I want you to hold that just for a moment as they pop up for you. And then I'm going to ask you questions. And the point of all of this activity is to demonstrate how ego and expertise aren't just a function of your mind, the nature of your mind, but they're also a function of the way that you set up your work life. So information you regularly consume, does it feed your ego and expertise, or does it trigger humility and curiosity? Just think on that for a moment. People who support you, do they typecast you or see your infinite potential? Do you hang out with people essentially who say, Bill's the mindfulness guy, right? And we're going to hang out with him because he's the mindfulness. Couldn't be anything else. If you have any questions about mindfulness, go to Bill. Inherently, what that does is it shrink wraps my ego and shrink wraps my expertise. And suddenly I've associated myself with this one piece of expertise when truly That gets in the way of honest development, which means getting outside of your expertise. What about people who annoy you? Do you see them as a nuisance or possibly your greatest teacher? And the way you plan your day. How many of your meetings have had too much on the agenda? What is the meeting really about? And last but not least, I think this is my favorite one, is your ability to let go. How much did that spelling mistake bother you? Check with yourself. That judgment, if it did, where did it come from? A lot. Rosanna Berkey says a lot. Ha ha ha, yes. Now I see why you put that there. Yeah, well, I did it on purpose because many of you were distracted by that, right? Here's this guy, he comes in, he's from Penn State. How can he make this kind of a mistake, right? But where does that judgment come from? The way that we judge, the way that we set up our lives, the way that we work with others really produces a scaffolding for access consciousness. And we need to break out of that. That's the third dimension that we really need to develop. Now, I'm going to kind of review what it's like to begin implementing these things and developing these things in organizations. I get a 10-minute warning from Layla here. Now this piece I can't go into too deeply, but what I wanted you to do is take a look at this and feel free to Google. This is where we can lean on artificial intelligence. If you see something that interests you, if you Google it or you shoot me an email, I can tell you a lot more about it. But essentially, there are 4 levels of developing this conscious agility in organizations. And they take place both socially and technologically. Level 1, let me see here, is formal. And this is formal meditation. So this is meditation you would do almost like strength training for your consciousness, for your phenomenal consciousness. These are different types of meditations. Level 2, eating, walking, presenting, office time, is actually integrating meditative practices, mindfulness practices into your everyday work routines. So now we're coming down from the mountain, Mount Fuji, into the city of work. Level 3 is applied mindfulness practice, and there's entire bodies of research on this. Stopping, relaxing in the moment, savoring, right? You get an award or you get a commendation, savoring it, right? How often do we go, oh no, not me, and then you move on, savor it, right? Metacognition, reflection and action. And level 4 is like really, truly integrated. And this is where hiring was one example, design thinking is another. But there are numerous ways that I study and I'm interested in integrating this developmental practice into everyday work. Now, technologically, it's amazing how much assists our ability to develop this third dimension. Smartphone apps that remind and guide us in meditation when we need it. There's discrete wearable biofeedback devices out there, some of which I do research with, that will remind and gauge where you're at and actually buzz you when you're not in that phenomenal state of consciousness where you're more creative. And you can actually link it to your Outlook calendar to see, if you're with somebody who typically annoys you and you want to practice being with them in an open, wise way, you can actually track your mind state against that particular place in the calendar. You also have software. So Mood Force is an example of a great software that crowdsources experimentation with creative and inclusive engagement at work. You can report correlations that exist with things that you're trying, new things that you're trying at work, and correlations with greater innovation and inclusion. Facial recognition, which we touched on earlier, and virtual reality. So one of the things I work on with students, some of them who are on this call, is virtual reality learning solutions that put people in direct, stressful, jarring situations, which aren't real, of course, so it's okay to make mistakes. But the practice is being aware of protecting one's own ego in the moment and relying too heavily on one's expertise, and practicing moving outside of that and being comfortable in that sort of void. Now, the last thing I'm going to offer here is that you can integrate AI with phenomenal consciousness. So here you have AI in the access consciousness lane. And then there are different social technologies that are out there that you can combine with the information you get with AI. And there are 4 ways to do this. The first way you can do this is through individuation and imaginal processing, which is where this comes from the work of Carl Jung, but I have to give credit to John Dirks for this. He works at Michigan State and studies ways of actually gaining access to different versions of yourself in the moment. So AI predictions are read aloud while participants are meditating. Participants notice and remember the symbols, colors, and sounds that come to them, and later report which side of them that object came from. And so you could take these predictions that do all the analysis for you, and if you want to be innovative with it, this is one way to actually trigger the phenomenal consciousness, capture or receive insights, and begin translating them into potential innovations. Another one is presencing practice. Check out the work of Otto Scharmer at the Presencing Institute up at MIT. This is an entire universe of work on getting yourself into phenomenal consciousness for both more inclusive and innovative behavior. So an AI search, for instance, could correlate large data sets and produce things called insight clusters, connections you couldn't figure out on your own, or maybe you wouldn't even think about. And one of the exercises that Otto Scharmer does is he has people do journaling and take on the lens of their younger self and their older self in looking at experience. And this is something that you can do and integrate with AI. Generative metaphor, the work of Donald Schoen. You could actually look at stakeholder data sets and look at unrelated data like nature and astrophysics and link that to your stakeholder data, their needs, for instance, and begin to generate metaphors that tell you a little bit more about potential for your stakeholders, maybe looking at your stakeholders through the lens of ecosystems. And last, presentational knowing is a really interesting form of tapping into phenomenal consciousness. And that is when you actually express what you're experiencing through the arts, music, dance, the arts. And there are ways that you can practice integrating this with artificial intelligence. Of course, all of this is cutting edge and is the future. But I want to remind everybody, and this is a very famous sort of idea that comes from the Zen tradition, that it's not the wind or the moon that stirs the waves. We have to conclude by assuming that it's actually your mind, and that's okay. That's okay. As long as we see it, we attend to it, we receive insights, turn them into innovation, receive a deeper sense of connection, and translate that into inclusive behaviors. So with that, I'm going to conclude this webinar, open up the Q&A. It looks like we only have a few minutes left. Feel free, if you don't get your question in, to shoot me an email or check out my website, transformativelearning.institute. Not .com, take that .com out, just transformativelearning.institute. All right, Jenny, what kind of questions do we have out there?
Okay, we have 3 questions, but it'll be good to ask 1 or 2 questions.
Okay.
The first question is about function of AI. So how AI will extract the best of us if it aims to exclude us?
Well, really the answer comes from the last couple of slides, which is that we are not, we shouldn't try to compete with AI. We should work together with AI. So as AI cuts into our lane of access consciousness, that thinking, analysis, that whole lane, we don't compete with it because we'll lose. We are going to lose to AI. Instead, we move into what is uniquely human about us, and that is our ability to think creatively, sense, feel, And this is a whole world of study that I'm interested in and will begin to proliferate in the near future.
Thank you. The second question is about preparation for the future as a HR specialist. So one participant asks you, what are the skills of the future? I am HR specialist. What do I need to do or to learn?
Well, remember that skill will chart. We're flipping that, we're flattening it, and we're making conscious agility the thing that we need to learn how to do par excellence in the next 5 to 10 years. If you look at any reports, they will tell you that things like self-awareness, creativity, compassion, metacognition, all of those things are the new wave, because all of our, analysis and the things that we do are being really stripped away by AI. So that's where you focus. And there are a lot of great conferences you can look at. Wisdom 2.0 is a fantastic conference. I suggest you also look at the Presencing Institute. Look at the work that the Transformative Learning Institute is doing to gain some deeper insight. That's a great question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It's almost 1 p.m., so we should finish up this webinar. Leila?
I would like to thank Dr. Brendel for sharing his knowledge, expertise, and wisdom with us today. If we did not get to your question, please feel free to send us an email, which you can find on your screen. On behalf of the OD&C program, we hope that you found this webinar helpful. Registration for all other events can be found on our social media platforms, and please feel free to visit our website on the screen or email us with any questions. Thank you all for attending today, and we hope to have you back on September 25th from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And please feel free to share our webinar series with your networks and social media platforms, as all are welcomed and invited. Thank you.
Thanks, Layla. Thanks, Jenny. And good luck to all of you.
Thank you.
Take care.